Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. This is our second lecture on a book that we really can't do justice to in even 100 10-minute lectures, but we're just trying to send you in a direction to think about Lolita as one of the, I think, one of the best novels I've ever read or reread. And again, it is a book that needs to be reread. Let's touch base on some general interests of Nabokov's. If we go back to an early book like Laughter in the Dark, he's playing certain games with us as readers. The basic techniques I would like you to see when he tells a story are very consistent with all the basic techniques of telling good stories, keeping in time, keeping us in scenes. If he shifts point of view, he lets us know it pretty quickly. He plays games with us as a writer that most writers don't do. I don't advocate this or recommend it as a style of writing novels, but it is definitely part of the Nabokovian style. If you think about Laughter in the Dark, we start off with a little précis, a little beginning. The story is beginning, middle, and end. This is what happens to Albinus. And yet, even though we know the story, we read through it all the way to the end, and at the end we have that kind of camera pull back after this man has collapsed, and we see the writer taking us out to the scene and closing down the cameras and closing the scene down as an indication that there's a controlling presence in the book. This interest in helping readers recognize the controlling presence of the novel is a very, very significant and recurring interest of Nabokov's. If you think about Laughter in the Dark, those of us who we don't recognize when we're being fooled suffer terrible fates. Albinus being fooled by Margot, or not seeing the manipulator in the room around him when he goes blind. This is the fate, the saddest fate of a character in Nabokov. And let's think about how that happens in Lolita. Okay, we have the same premise set up early in the book. The first person we hear from is the psychoanalyst who misunderstands everything about the case. He thinks Humbert's a homosexual. He thinks that Humbert has all sorts of issues which have nothing to do with Humbert's interest in Lolita. And he thinks that when you read this book, you're going to learn something about child molesters. It's an educational book that will teach you something about how these people operate. But obviously, one of the jokes for Nabokov is this: John Ray Jr. doesn't understand anything about his clients or his patients. As Humbert says several times in his story, he loves to fool the psychoanalysts because they're so easy to fool. That's something very important to remember. Now, we then have, after the opening preface, which is something that I'm sure I skipped the first time I read it, it's putting us on warning. It's saying, people are going to read this book wrong. Be the person who reads it right. For Nabokov, novels are not educations about how molesters act or how the world should be. They're educations in reading and enjoying books, and then reading and enjoying and understanding other people. Now, Nabokov sets this up as a diary. We start off with basically not just the Lolita light of my life. It is a testimony to the jury. Humbert starts off as an unreliable narrator as you can get. He's writing this book in order to exonerate himself. Now, once you get that in the opening of a book, the first thing a reader should be thinking is, well, when is he telling the truth and when isn't he? This is something Nabokov wants you to be thinking about all the time in fiction, and he's going to make sure you're going to be thinking about it in this book. So we have Humbert telling us the story, telling us how he loves to fool people. He's continually talking about how he likes to hoax people. Remember the hoaxing again as Albinus. He likes to hoax the doctors particularly. He likes to tell stories that aren't true. Now, when we get into the text then, we'll have a number of important plot points where Nabokov will be saying, well, for example, I didn't molest this girl. She molested me. It's something that you would expect from a Humbert. In other words, we're not getting the real world behind Humbert. We're getting Humbert's vision of the world. Now, that is one of the things you've always got to think about as a writer. When you're any characters, whether they're telling the story or you're meeting them in a scene or they're telling a story of their own life in a scene, characters are unreliable. We all are unreliable narrators. But Nabokov is framing his entire book in this unreliability. So we have the entire document of Lolita as occurring, of him telling his story of this woman, and he wants to preserve her. Remember, he wants to preserve her forever. He wants her to be a repeatable experience. He wants to have, remember there's that horrifying scene where he says, I want to have the child with Lolita so that I can have another child with her, and I can keep reliving this experience. Lolita will never grow old. She will never become a woman or an old woman. She will always be this just about to blossom creature. And this is what he's trying to achieve in the book that Humbert writes. And it's also in the bigger book that Nabokov is trying to write for you. He wants you to be able to not just read this book once, and this is very important. He needs you to read it several times. Now, when you get to the end of the novel, and you start to recognize, he starts to, one of the other ways he's unreliable to you, remember this, is he's written the book. He knows what's happened. Claire Quilty, who shows up several times in the opening chapters, he's referred to as the man that Lowe had a crush on, the man in the smoking ad, the dromedary ad, and all of these references to Quilty are lost on us as readers the first time through. We are like Humbert, who hears all of these clues, but he doesn't know them. And when he writes his book, he makes sure that we are fooled just as he was fooled. So you remember that. He's really deliberate. He keeps saying, I want you to experience this story the way I experienced it. That Quilty was all over the place, but I never saw him. Now I'm going to read one little passage, which is when Humbert goes to the Enchanted Hunter's Lodge, and a passage that you're not going to understand the first time you read it. You'll have to read it again and again. This is page 141. No, I'm sorry, it's not 141. It's page 127. And before Humbert gets back to he's about to go up and sleep with Lolita, he has this whole fantasy. The original fantasy for Humbert is he's going to keep her asleep. She'll never know she was molested. He's going to drug her, and then every night when he wants to have her, he will drug her, and she will never be affected by any of this. It's all going to be in his head, and he can act it out in a secret fantasy. Now, as he goes out and wanders through the hotel, he runs into a man, 127, and the man's smoking. The man in the dromedary ad, it's dromedary, the camel cigarettes, a joke on camels. He's smoking, and he says to him, where the devil did you get her? And Humbert says, I beg your pardon? I said, the weather is getting better. Now, the first time you read this scene, you're thinking, oh, Humbert is so guilty and frightened about what's happening. He's getting paranoid and thinks people know what's going on. It's not what's happening. Claire Quilty is the man with a cigarette, and he's teasing him. He's saying something, muttering one thing, and then when he double checks on him, he says, oh, I was just asking, what do you think about the weather? Now listen to this whole scene. I'll read it through now from the beginning. Where the devil did you get her? I beg your pardon? I said the weather is getting better. Seems so. Who's the lassie? My daughter. You lie, she's not. I beg your pardon. I said July was hot. Where's her mother? Dead. I see. Sorry, by the way, why don't you two lunch with me tomorrow? That dreadful crowd will be gone by then. This is all the actors and all the loose characters that are running around and having orgies and taking drugs and raising hell everywhere they go. We'll be gone too. Good night. Sorry, I'm pretty drunk. Good night. That child of yours needs a lot of sleep. Sleep is a rose, as the Persians say. Smoke? Not now. He struck a light. Now, there's no way in the world that you're going to know that's Claire Quilty. And as we go through the book, and when Lolita disappears, Lolita lies to Humbert. She said, "Oh, Claire Quilty, yeah, it's a woman. She's the woman who works on the play." When you read through the second time, you'll see that everyone's playing games with each other about this Q, question. And the identity of Q is something that Humbert never understands. But he understands it when he's writing the book, but he's preventing you from understanding it. And at the same time, Nabokov is writing the book that Humbert's delivering to you, and he's making you pay attention as a reader. He's making you think, and he's making you read carefully, and not simply be fooled, because the techniques of fiction that we're all talking about, trying to get you to learn how to write your own novels, those basic techniques are ways of fooling people into believing these characters exist. They're stories, they're made up. And we bring some reality to these novels, hopefully, or we hope, and yet we can't claim that's real world. It's the real world. So Nabokov is always making you think about that and to be smart readers. And when you finish Lolita, if you don't read it again, you'll have missed the whole book. Like his fantasy of Lolita, and Lolita is not a girl Nabokov's idea, it's his idea of a work of art. You go back over it again, and you read it again, and you read it again. And you really have to read Lolita several times. And the last thing I'll leave you with is, you'll remember that there's a character running around in this. I don't know if you can see this. Vivian Darkbloom. And she shows up every once in a while with Q. She's the woman with like a long hair, and she looks like the woman. I always imagine her as the woman in the Addams Family, Morticia. She's got this long hair and long black dresses. And Vivian Darkbloom is some nebulous character that's running around. But if you look at those letters, and you will find an anagram for the name Vladimir Nabokov. So he's created a brilliant little anagram for himself, and he's let her float around in the book. And in the same way that we've got to recognize Q is out there, and that Q is playing games with us or Humbert, and that Humbert is playing games with us, Nabokov always likes to let you know he's out there playing games with all of them. Okay. Anyway, it's a lovely book. Read it many times. It repays rereading. Okay. Bye.